I'm Eleni, and I'm going to talk about two tools of the human-centric leading. One is a triad, and the other is using emotions as data. So oftentimes in organizational settings, we have emotions. We get angry or frustrated or anxious or disgusted even at some people's behavior or our own. And we are socialized to keep those emotions at bay. And what happens as a function of keeping them at bay is they intensify. And they intensify, and it gets really more and more intense, as if you're putting helium in a balloon. Like, it gets bigger and bigger. And with some people, it explodes outward. And so somebody might get really angry at a very tiny thing, like someone spilled some water on a table or on their business cards and they explode. That could be a function of, not dealing with emotions for a while. And another thing is imploding. So it goes inward, like getting sick, getting neck pain, digestive problems, insomnia, ulcers, all kinds of things. So we want to be more healthy and more balanced. And the human-centric leading model looks at emotions as data, as useful information or data that we can use to make better decisions. So we can express them in the moment without getting, extreme about it and becoming what people call emotional. That word, like being emotional, that word and has a connotation. We've been using it as a bad thing, as someone who can't control their emotions. Well, emotions are not really controllable in the sense that they're just natural flowing, but because we suppress them, we feel like we can control them, but they really come out in other ways. So what we talk about is regulate or express or use them as data. We use different words than control your emotions so that it's a more balanced approach. Now, this is an example of a vice president in a company, a startup company of about 200 people. And this person is a VP of sales. And he got promoted like few months ago. And he had been, for all his career until then, he had been doing sales. Okay. And now he's a VP of sales, which is completely different. It's not all operational. It is strategic. And he's not the one who's in the weeds, so to speak. He must create a context or a culture in which the salespeople can thrive. So it's a very different viewpoint. So what he was noticing in his experience of being a VP is that he's anxious often, he's angry and frustrated, and he fears making mistakes, and he fears the associated consequences. And so he really wants validation. So he was realizing that he needs validation to feel confident, but with his new boss, the CEO, he's not getting it. And so he feels worried that he's going to make mistakes because in all his other jobs, he'd had some validation, even if it was, I go out and sell and I make my numbers. That's validation that I'm doing the right thing. But in an executive level, it's more nuanced. It's more strategic. It has more, more ambiguity and uncertainty than a salesperson just going after numbers. And so he's finding himself that, wow, I was actually very dependent on validation and I didn't realize it, but now that I'm not really getting it from my boss, I notice all these emotions come up. And so what's underneath this is really a fear of the consequences, like, am I the one who made this mistake? And then we all have lower, revenues and we have to close the company. I mean, it's extreme, of course. So, this triad is based on a fear of, I can't handle the consequences. I can't handle what might happen if I make a mistake and if my work or my strategy is not immediately validated. And so in trying to work through this, we started to use, the emotions as data toolkit. So this is a triad, and then we say, okay, the emotions as data tool is name the emotion. So we're going to use anxiety, anger, and frustration in this example. Decode it, which means you have to come to understand what emotions mean. You can do that intuitively, or you can do it by reading books and getting access to lists that we have that have been already identified as what does anger mean, what does frustration mean by psychologists and other researchers. So you don't have to know that immediately. And then you respond to it instead of doing the old approach of avoiding it, controlling it, suppressing it, repressing it, all these things that we've been taught to do, but that really don't work. And what we're seeing in the last 20 years is with the emotional intelligence movement, it's saying emotions do matter. And of course it matters in human-centered leading because we see the whole human. And humans are emotional beings who think. We're not thinking beings who emote like we used to think in the old times. So it's a new understanding of what it means to be human. So let's do these 3 emotions. We've named them. I'm anxious, I'm angry, I'm frustrated. We decode it. What does anxiety mean? I'm in the future. I'm not in the present moment. I'm thinking about what bad thing could happen in the future. Oftentimes based on the past. Okay, I didn't do well on this yesterday. I'm worried about not doing it well tomorrow. Or we didn't, make our numbers last month. I'm worried about. So this is meaning you're in the future, not in the present moment. And one of the ways to respond to it, instead of ignoring the anxiety, is to say, okay, firstly, let me get in the present. Okay, and me as a person or the team, we could say, if we're anxious about this situation as an executive, if this executive is anxious, he could say, okay, in the present moment, what could I do to make myself feel good? He could draw out another triad, like the triad that might say he's calm, he's confident, he's adaptable. So he can draw out another triad, which we could do in another video, but here we're talking about the emotions as data. And so basically, he could also inquire, like, what is he so anxious about? What could happen? What is the worst case scenario? And then he could create a plan A, plan B, plan C to deal with those anxieties. And so that helps him use the anxiety as information as what he could do so he could feel better. Yeah? So it's not ignore it, suppress it, and assume anxiety or any emotion is useless. And so when we all talk about our emotions in the moment, like, God, I'm really anxious. I don't have to go and do something about it immediately. I could notice it, and that noticing expresses the emotion, helps express the emotion. Not fully, maybe. It depends on the level of anxiety. But if it's the level here with this person, he wasn't super anxious that he was paralyzed, but he was, agitated. So he could start making a plan as to how to use that anxiety to inform him to make better decisions. If he ignores that, it will intensify, and until it explodes or implodes. Then angry. Anger, so we named it. Anger is something usually responding to something unfair that has happened. So in this case, he's angry that his boss is not giving him the validation he needs and wants. So he's angry. He feels like that's unfair because he's not getting a lot of time with his boss. It also could be linked to a dislike, like I want something and I'm not getting it, and that's frustration as well, which is I want X and I'm getting Y. I expect my boss will validate me. When he doesn't, I get mad. So you can start to learn that frustration is a milder version of anger. And so what does he do? He says, okay, well, how do I solve that? One of the ways he started to solve it is question, well, what if I can validate myself? Or what's another way of getting validation? What am I really worried about? And so he started making plans around all these other issues so that he feels he can handle whatever happens, not necessarily alone. He's one person in this 200-person company. It's not to say he needs to do it alone, but he can find other ways to get his validation needs met. Firstly, depend on himself, which meant that he had to learn more about what it means to be an executive. What are the expectations on his side? What are the expectations on his boss's side, the CEO? What did the company need from him as an executive? So that would help him know what is expected of him. What that is like some validation. If he started behaving in a certain way, like setting up a team culture, executives do that. So that's a type of validation. So he didn't he doesn't need to depend on only one person, his boss, to give it to him. So whenever we're using triads or using emotions as data, it's really self-work, but it doesn't mean we have to do it alone. We can reach out to people. We can make these plans with others. We can invite all kinds of stakeholders within a company. Like this executive, he could invite the other executives and say, what do you expect from me? What do we think the company needs from me and my team? And so it can be collegial and supportive. It's not, necessarily doing it on your own all the time. So with anger, you usually question, like, how do I best deal with something unfair? Instead of being angry and not expressing my anger and getting angrier and angrier, and then I start yelling and screaming, or I avoid things altogether, I could face the anger and say, okay, what has happened? So it helps people become aware of what's going on. Because through our society, we've been so accustomed to ignoring emotions. Some people have told me they don't have emotions. So that's how separated they feel from that emotional context. But as you start seeing errors or mistakes, or stress is another experience of emotion, you can start realizing, oh, I actually have emotions and I have not been able to understand them or decode them. So usually people know when they're angry, because that's an acceptable emotion for most people. And frustration is definitely the one that I see in most organizations around the world. That's like a go-to emotion, unfortunately, because so many things are, out of synchronicity. So, if there's an unfairness or a dislike, this person could start to question, what could I do to get what I need so I won't be angry? What could I question my expectations? So the frustration is another emotion. It means I expect something and I'm getting another thing. Could I question my expectation? Could I question the timing? Maybe I expect things too fast. Could I question, maybe the team is not mature enough, and I've been doing, in this experience, he's been doing a lot of the sales stuff, even though he's supposed to be doing the executive stuff, because he didn't know how to do it yet. So that could have ramifications on his team. They'll be like, well, I'm supposed to do that. Why are you doing that? And it could create anger on their part. And so he could start questioning, are his expectations right? Is he doing what he's supposed to do? Or is he doing other people's jobs? How do they feel about it? What would it take to create the ideal outcome? So if we're frustrated, we're like, okay, what do we need? What do we need to feel resourceful in this moment so that we can move forward? And so this is then a way to use the triads and the emotions as data in order to move then to a new triad and live in that triad. So that means oftentimes when, in other videos you might have seen, I have a triad here and the go-to triad here, and we haven't talked about everything because I do things separately in each video. But basically this could happen as well before going to another triad, or to help you move from one triad to another. Because oftentimes we have an ideal triad or the triad we want to be in, but we can't stay there. We get angry again, or we get anxious again, because this is a habitual experience. And so we work through it, and we work through the emotions every single day, every moment, every hour, whenever they come up. And it might sound like a lot of work, but it really becomes very simple after you get used to it, after you know how to do it. So don't, just like any other skill, when you're practicing at the beginning, it takes an enormous amount of effort, like piano, violin, anything. But then when you're good at it, it's much easier, and that happens intuitively. These are intuitive tools that we've been out-socialized or socialized not to use anymore. And so when we relearn them, because they're natural, they come quickly. So if you want to take one takeaway out of this video, is you could think about one set of emotions that you have, maybe that are persistent, maybe that emotion like you feel it every day, it's common, maybe it's a pattern, maybe it's a very strong habit, and you can use this methodology to analyze it and then decide what other ways you could act.